Some people want to be colorblind. The problem with being colorblind is that you assume that everybody's going to be the same. Think back in the history of American Indians. Once upon a time they tried to do the same thing to you guys. They sent you all to boarding schools, and when they sent you to boarding schools, they wanted you to look like and act like and speak the same language as everybody else. That's being colorblind. It's not the worst thing in the world, being colorblind, seeing people and not trying to identify their race or their ethnicity. That's not a bad idea. The problem is you don't give them credit for who they are. People like to be recognized as to who they are. And of course the other approach is known as a multicultural approach, where you accept people for who they are. You accept their culture and you honor everybody's culture. Eventually we got to this point in the United States. For the longest time, the federal government, they had all these immigrants coming in from really weird places, and they were trying to make everybody the same. So they were teaching everybody, making people go to the same high schools, and they learned civics, and they learned what it was like to be an American. I mean, that's what we're arguing about right now with the impeachment trial. It's kind of interesting listening to the arguments, because sometimes they argue points of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers have to do with how we set up our government. The Federalist Papers, it was a series of pamphlets that came out. It was being written by John Madison. It's being written by Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, not George Washington especially. John Adams was writing in the Federalist Papers. They were trying to determine how they could be different and better than the English government. That was the idea. So at that point, of course, we had all these immigrants coming in. Most of the people in the United States were from England, but some of them were from Germany. And Germans have different ideas than Americans do, than Englishmen do. So they were trying to determine what kind of a government that they were going to have. And actually, that's what's going on right now with the impeachment trial. They're trying to figure out whether Donald Trump committed high crimes and misdemeanors. That's what they're trying to figure out, whether he did it or not. Well, we know what he did, but the question is it a high crime and misdemeanors? How would the founders feel if they were the ones sitting in judgment of Donald Trump? That's really what's going on. And of course, one side says no, and the other side says yes, and it's an interesting argument to listen to. And eventually, he's going to be acquitted. Everybody says he's going to be acquitted, mainly because there are 53 Republicans in the Senate and only 47 Democrats. The other reason is because in order for him to be prosecuted, to be found impeachable, or he already is impeached, to be found guilty, then they would have to have 67 people. And that means that 20 people would have to come across the aisle and vote to take him out of office. As fascinating as all this is, but this all has to do with multiculturalism, because for a long time in the United States we were trying to make everybody Americans. And how do you do that? Well, you make sure that everybody gets the same education, no matter whether they're Italian or Japanese or American Indian. And that's one of the reasons why they sent you guys to boarding school. They were trying to make you the same as everybody else. They had all these fresh immigrants coming into the United States from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe. Not that many from Germany anymore, but, well, actually a lot coming in from Germany. This is between 1880 and 1920, and that's one of the reasons why they forced us into this idea of the, what do they call it? Melting pot. This idea of the melting pot, where the American culture came out of all of these disparate, different ideas. So where do we get Christmas trees from? Well, that's a German tradition. You know, it's weird as that is. So why don't you know, who comes to our house and gives us presents? Turns out to be Santa Claus. Well, where did Santa Claus come from? Santa Claus came from Holland. Well, that's kind of cool. How about St. Nicholas? St. Nicholas is a German thing, but he doesn't come to our house, does he? Because St. Nicholas Day is the 15th of December. And in Germany, that's Christmas Day, St. Nicholas Day, in Germany. But we still have the Christmas trees, that's from Germany. Okay, I know, there's a lot of silly things.
Interesting.
I know, our culture is just all mixed up. And it is kind of a melting pot, in essence. But then in the 1950s, of course, through the 1950s, everybody was supposed to be the same. Everybody was supposed to be the same. It's a melting pot. We didn't look at negative things. We didn't see negative things anyway. They wanted everybody to be Christian. Of course, there were some people in the United States that were Jewish. We had our first Jewish Supreme Court justice in the 1950s. I can't think of his name, but he was the first. He was the first Jewish justice. The first Catholic justice was in the 1950s as well. The first African American justice was in the 1960s. So things are changing. Things are different than they used to be. Minority groups tend to greatly value their group identity, and they often respond quite negatively to efforts by the majority group members to ignore what makes them distinctive. And of course, this is why multiculturalism is so important. It allows people that aren't from the dominant culture to have their own culture, to create their own culture, not to create their own culture, but to have their own culture and to have it recognized by the rest of the society. Efforts to downplay group differences may come across as suggesting that minority members would be accepted as long as they shed their distinctive cultural identities and act like those in the majority group. And this is a really popular idea. It's a popular idea with people in the United States today, with more conservative people in the United States. They want everybody to be the same. When they see somebody on the street, they don't want to worry about whether they will offend them if they try to talk to them in a select way. My dad, when he found out that I was going to teach at a tribal college, he said, well, I don't really believe in reservations. I think they need to do away with all the reservations and make those people just live on their own land, the farmland, like he does. And, you know, we had 20 acres. It wasn't that large a farm. But that's what he wanted everybody to do. He thought that it wasn't fair that American Indians got things that he didn't get. Of course, he didn't understand treaty rights and whatnot. But there was a movement in the Republican Party back in the when was Reagan president? 80 to 88. Back in the 1980s to do away with the reservations. Reagan didn't like the idea that you guys were distinctive from other people, from other Americans, and he wanted to do away with the reservations. He wasn't able to do it, but he was able to damage people. One of the things that he did, they were building housing on the reservations, HUD housing. It's relatively inexpensive housing that they could put together fairly cheaply. But then he cut the funding for plumbing. Great, you got electricity, but you got no toilet, okay? You still had to go to the outhouse. So he cut all the funding, and for some reason it had to do with a presidential directive. And he kept all the funding to your plumbing. And it wasn't until Clinton became president that they actually put your plumbing in. Or the plumbing in those houses. So if you wander around select reservations around the United States, their plumbing's all on the outside. Well, it's outside the walls. I know, it should be inside the walls, but they'd have to tear down the walls in order to put the plumbing in. Because there wasn't any plumbing with the houses. Oh, great. As weird as that is. So multiculturalism is a better idea. We allow people to have their own cultures, and we recognize the fact Are black people different than Hispanic people? Are Hispanic people different than white people? Are white people different than American Indians? And the answer is yes, 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 and yes. If somebody's from Lithuania, do they have a different culture than people from France? Sure they do, of course they do. I used to live in Omaha, and Omaha has all of these different ethnic groups. Now, why in the world would Omaha have so many different ethnic groups? So many different identifiable ethnic groups? Well, the reason is because Omaha had slaughterhouses. So as the immigrants came in and they needed a place to work, they went to the slaughterhouses. And Omaha is a great place to butcher cattle. It's a great place to butcher cattle. So as they came in, the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, different groups came in. Italians came in, the Polish came in, who else was it? Italians, Polish, Czechoslovakians came in, but it turned out, who knew that the Czechs and the Slovaks don't like each other? They're both Catholic, but they don't like each other. They have their own saints, as interesting as that was. So, and Czechoslovakia was put together after World War I. There was both of them were part of the Austrian Empire, and they just decided to stick the two together. It's a long, narrow country or it used to be, it's not anymore. So the Czechs and the Slovaks came in, and they hate each other, as strange as that may seem. The reason the Austrians would separate them, and there's an area between the two countries. The Czech Republic's over here, and the Slovakian Republic's over here. This is mostly urban and industrialized, and this was mostly rural and agricultural. And in between was an area called Moravia. And so the Austrian Empire, in order to keep the Slovaks from going over and butchering all the Czechs, or the Czechs from butchering all the Slovaks, they put somebody in between that they would both butcher. So who was that they put in there? It was the Jewish people. They put Jews in there. And that's where Freud is from. Freud's from Moravia, that area in between the Czech Republic and the Slovakian Republic. Who knew that they didn't like each other? So while I was in Omaha, and each ethnic group had their own high school, because it was a Catholic high school. Each one of them had their own high school. So I was a soccer coach. I was a soccer coach, high school soccer coach, and we played soccer against all those guys. You're saying this, Dan. We played soccer against all those guys, and of course, we'd play Cathedral, and it turned out to be Italian, and we'd play St. Mary's, and it was Polish. We just never knew who we were going to run up against, but it's always kind of interesting running up against all these Catholics. Okay, so they were trying to make everybody the same. They had all these different immigrant groups coming in. They needed to make them all Americans. One of the things that they were afraid of was Bolshevism. They were deathly afraid of the communists. They were deathly afraid of the anarchists. So what they were trying to do, they were trying to make them all good Americans, good democratic Americans. And that's one of the reasons why, when you read old history books, it's like propaganda. For one thing, they leave out, history books leave out anything that has to do with American Indians. It's like, you guys gave us the land, thanks. Wow, that was really nice of you guys to give us all that land. You weren't using it, so you just kind of gave it to us. There wasn't any conflicts going on. From time to time, of course, they talked about the Indian Wars, but not very often. So now we live in a world that is fairly multicultural. If you watch television, and of course, I'm 70 years old, so I've been watching this over time. Uh-oh.
Oh, looks like a page.
So anyway, I've been watching this over time. Once upon a time, if you watch television, there was no There were no black people on television, certainly not on anybody's commercials. But there were black people on some of the television shows. And then they started having television shows that were about black people. And sometimes they became very popular. The Cosby Show, for example. And that's one of the reasons why when Bill Cosby, they finally caught Bill Cosby doing what he was doing, people were just brokenhearted because he was one of the first. And he was one of the first really acceptable and not angry black people that we had on television, which was kind of exciting. And now everything has changed. Studies done looking at corporations found that the more multicultural and the less colorblind the attitudes of the white employees, the more the minority employees were engaged in their work. In other words, they felt more comfortable when people recognized who they were and mentioned that, who they were. In the same study, the researchers discovered that minority employees had more trust in and comfort with a company that offers multicultural messages rather than one that offers colorblind messages, especially when the company has only a few minority members. How would you like it if you went to work for a company and they pretended that you were the same as everybody else? Well, that's almost insulting because your culture is your culture, and they need to understand what your culture is and who you are. That makes you more comfortable. If they start acting and thinking that you're going to act like a white person, that's not right. Or talk like a white person, or think like a white person. That's just not correct. So multiculturalism is what we teach, what this class is all about, multiculturalism. Singling out everybody's culture, not singling out as negative, not even the Sambia, the individuals who perform pedophilia. We would never, ever accept that type of behavior if it was in the United States. But, of course, it's their culture. This gets really kind of tough because there's a lot of questions out there that we could ask that potentially are fairly negative. One of them is female circumcision. A lot of people are really pissed off with female circumcision, but there are people that swear by female circumcision. As weird as that sounds. And they perform it in the United States. They have to do it surreptitiously, but they still do it in the United States. Now, one of the interesting things about this television season, there's a new television show called Bob Hart's Abishola. Have you seen it? It's really a pretty good show. Bob's that big fat guy off of Somebody in Molly. Mike and Molly. Yeah, it's a big guy. It's a big guy off of Mike and Molly. He's Bob. And Abishola is a Nigerian woman that he falls in love with. Oh my God. She's not just black, she's African. She's a black African. Oh my goodness gracious. And this is the television show. It is really kind of interesting. Now, one of the things I know about Nigeria, because I've had Nigerian students, is that a large percentage of the females in Nigeria have been circumcised. I was talking to a Nigerian who was a Christian Nigerian, and of course Muslims will circumcise females from time to time. Sub-Saharan, and especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. But he was a Christian, and he said he would never marry a woman who wasn't circumcised. That's what he said. So this is really kind of interesting because I'm waiting to find out how they deal with female circumcision, or whether that even comes up.
What is that, or can you explain that?
What, female circumcision? Well, there's several different types of female circumcision. In one, they cut off the labia majora, and another type they cut off both the majora and the minora, the skin on the outside. And then another one, they actually cut the clitoris off, which is kind of like pulling the claws out of a cat. That sounds really horrible. I know, it sounds god-awful, but I mean, it's part of their culture, so there's not a whole lot that you can argue about. I guess we could argue about it if you want to. A lot of people are up in arms about it. They think it's vicious and monstrous. But when we're talking about circumcision, you're talking about cutting something off of their sexual parts. I mean, a circumcised male has his foreskin cut off. So, I mean, that's
Sorry, I had to ask.
That's
Notice
okay.
everybody got uncomfortable when I asked.
Did everybody else know what female
I know what it is.
Yeah, okay.
I'm gonna look it up later.
Don't look up. Don't. Anyway, it's part of their culture. So the question is it going to come up in the television show? Should be interesting. Ethnocentrism is judging people from other cultures by the standards of one's own culture. That's what Europeans did when they first came over here, especially the Spanish. They wanted to Christianize all the indigenous peoples in the Americas because, of course, that's the only way to be as far as they were concerned. A lot of religions think there's only one way to be, and that's my way. It's either my way or the highway. I was married to a lady one time who was a member of a church, the one-way church. And their symbol was a finger pointing up, a hand pointing up with one finger. Of course, I always saw it as the wrong finger, but it was really kind of interesting. There was only one that, you know, if you weren't a member of that church, you're going to hell. I know. And a lot of people think that their church is the only church. That's the only way to get to heaven, is to practice that religion. And so ethnocentrism is where you gauge them by you. I mean, if you were to look at the Apache and say, they don't do things right because their ceremonies are incorrect. I know because I've been to all the proper Athabascan ceremonies, and the Navajo are the only ones that do it right. That's ethnocentrism. They do things their way, you guys do things your own way. The Hopi are completely different than you guys. Their language doesn't have anything to do with Athabascan. Their religion is completely different than your religion. It would be like you going into where is that place over by Minnekopi? Over by Tuba City? What is that? Monkopi? Is that the way you pronounce it? I've only seen it written, I've never seen it. I've never heard it pronounced.
Gas station?
Thank you. This is really kind of weird. I've been here for 5 years. You're the first person that's ever mentioned that town. I mentioned the first. You told me how to. Monkopi, is that the way you?
Yeah, Moenkopi.
Moenkopi. Okay. Yeah. So it'd be like you going to Moenkopi and saying, you know, you guys, this Kiva stuff. You guys are all full of bananas. There shouldn't be any.
Oh my God.
I know.
You get shot at.
Yeah. Well, potentially. Well, I don't know. Hopis are pretty happy people, pretty friendly. I don't think they'd shoot you. They'd just probably laugh at you,
Nanny you.
I'm guessing. Our cultures ultimately socialize us to be ethnocentric. We don't have a choice. Because if you live in Saley all your life, you think Saley is the only way to be. This is the proper way to be a good Navajo. Is the Saley way. Everybody knows that. And this is one of my fears. I guess I'm putting this on tape. One of my fears is that as a student here at Dene College, pretty much it's Wilson's way or the highway, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he wrote the book. So is that the only way to be a good Navajo? Is to follow Wilson's ideas of things? I've actually talked to him about this before. You want me to tell you what he said?
Yeah.
He said, no, this isn't the only way to be a good Navajo. I don't know. If he quizzes you and he says you're wrong because you're talking about how your grandmother did it, I don't think he'd mark it correct. Do you?
I don't know, I keep on getting B's in that class.
Yeah.
I never get A's in there.
As long as you're getting B's, I guess we're okay.
I know. I do know some. I know more about ceremonies, but I always think you flow great.
Yeah, you
I don't
do.
know why.
Like if you calculate your grade, attendance, doing the homework, everything,
Mhm.
it comes out to an A, but then like when final or it goes on your transcript, it's a B, and you're just like, it don't make sense.
Someone needs to check that, because I always get A's in that class, and he tells me he's very careful when he talks about being mixed, and like, he's like, if you're not Navajo, you shouldn't be hearing this, and he kind of like looks at me like, okay. So he's basically saying if you're mixed, you're not even Navajo. Don't even go to ceremonies, don't even do anything. You're just that other side. And I passed
Yeah,
that
got it.
class. That's why I'm like wondering.
You got an A. I don't know. Probably because
I
it's my last
think
name.
the subject you're talking about one way or the other,
Yeah.
that's just here on campus. But when you go to different agencies, it's a different story.
To a city, ain't the
Yeah.
same.
And
Pinata
they have
ain't
a
the-
different way of being out there.
Right.
The Western agency, the
Yeah.
belief system and ceremonial structure is different from the central agency here.
Yeah.
So you're basically teaching different things to different agencies, or it's not adding up.
Yeah, I'm from the Western agency, and it's like different. And then just certain things are different.
That's ethnocentrism. Now do you understand what ethnocentrism is? Okay.
Can I write a paper on it?
We try not to be ethnocentric. And of course, I can tell you not to be ethnocentric, but you'll have to talk to Wilson about it. Well, don't talk to Wilson about it. I don't think you're gonna get an answer.
I don't want
Okay.
anybody to get offended.
Oh, yeah.
In the 1950s, with the advance of brain imaging techniques, psychology entered the cognitive revolution. What am I talking about, the cognitive revolution? I talk about the arguments that Sarah and I had all the time. She's not the first cognitive psychologist I've ever hooked horns with. But cognitive psychologists believe that that is the way to look at things, at the world, from a cognitive point of view. How do people think? What's their brain structure? And this all came in with the advance of technology. Suddenly, we had CAT scans, we had MRIs, we had PET scans, and suddenly we could watch people thinking. And of course, that's what they wanted in the beginning, or that's what they supported in the beginning. So they tried to say things like, well, Freud and Skinner and Watson and Rogers, all those guys, well, since they couldn't image this stuff, none of their theories are any good. So they kind of throw those theories out the window. Freud was full of bananas because he never did any research. Of course, he didn't do any research. There was nothing he could have done to support his ideas. But what if Freud had never been? What if Freud was just a neurosurgeon and never wrote anything about what people were thinking? Would there be a psychology philosophy out there? Would we even exist? I wouldn't have a job. I'd probably be shoveling snow or something up in Indiana somewhere. I don't know.
You know, I actually thought that too while I was reading a lot of these theories. I just thought, what if somebody else wrote this stuff?
Yeah.
Would their terms be different, or definition, or their outlook on what the subject is be different?
You know, that's an excellent point, and I think you're absolutely correct. If a Brit had written it rather than an Austrian, if it had been a Christian that wrote it instead of a Jewish person, would it have been as acceptable to society? Would it look exactly the same? If we look at Freud and Jung, Jung was a evangelical Christian. He was a Swiss Reformed Church. So his way of looking at the world was completely different. It had to do with Christianity, but when Freud wrote about his stuff, it didn't have anything to do with religion. But of course, as a Christian, you can't get away from it. Yes, sir.
Another thing too is the information. You know how some countries and cultures, they have certain information on life, but then it don't go too far. It just
Right.
stays with their culture.
It has to, because of the religion. It truncates what they're thinking or what they can possibly say. So cognitive psychologists, they said, well, let's throw all this stuff out and we'll just look at the structure of things and how things are put together. And that was the cognitive movement. Now the first technology they had were computers. So they started comparing the human mind to computers. So when I first started in this discipline, that was what we thought, that's what cognitive psychology was. It was just a repeat. They were talking about how the human brain is just like a computer, as bizarre as that was. And that was offensive to me. It was offensive to me because, you know, I have a lot of really strange thoughts. What does that have to do with a computer? I can think faster than a computer. I'm smarter than a computer. A computer only knows what you tell it. But I have original thoughts. And that was my point when I was arguing with cognitivists in the beginning. Now, of course, they've got MRIs and PET scans and whatnot. So it has changed a little bit. It has evolved as things have evolved. So if you look at the old cognitivists, they were hooked on the computer. They wanted to look at the human brain as if it were a computer. But one of the fathers of the cognitive revolution, Jerome Bruner, argued that the proponents of the cognitive revolution had become distracted from its initial vision by becoming more concerned with computer metaphors for understanding the functioning of the mind. Meaning became replaced with information, and they used to talk about the human mind as if it were a computer. They didn't talk about meaning behind something, they talk about information. Meaning making became replaced with information processing. How do we information process? Where does your memory come from? So these individuals, they really concentrate on those aspects of the human brain, especially memory. Memory was a huge deal as far as they were concerned. So if you read your chapter in Gen Psych, when you took Gen Psych, if you read the chapter about memory, a lot of the words that they used were words that came right out of computer technology, as bizarre as that was. But then Jerome Bruner argued that cultural psychology has picked up the torch that was originally carried by early proponents of cognitive revolution and has again addressed how people derive meaning from their environments. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. We're going to talk about how your environment creates the person that you are as compared to everybody having the same structure of brains and the way your brain processes information. My God. Are we human or are we machines? I don't know. I see those things stuck in people's ears, and you know, you say hi and they don't hear you because they're walking along listening to whatever. I had no idea. Maybe they're connected to, I don't know, some supreme being or a UFO or an extraterrestrial. You guys don't have that, so it's kind of exciting. I appreciate you not having those things stuck in your ears. Or you're playing video games on your telephone or whatever. My grandson plays video games on my wife's telephone, and it lost all of its memory, or he used up all the memory in my wife's telephone. He had all these games that he had downloaded. You know, okay. So then we're going to talk about culture and human nature. And I apologize, I didn't mean to tell you about this doll. So just pretend she's not here, okay? I know, it offends my wife every time I talk about it. Humans are quite particular about whom they choose to imitate. As humans, of course, how do we know how to dress? I wear a coat. My dad wore a suit every day. He was a banker, so he wore a suit every day and a tie. So when I started working outside the military, I always wore a suit, not a suit and tie, but I always wore a tie. Of course, I was working in medicine, so I had a lab coat on. I looked like a doctor, so people sometimes thought I was a doctor. But I was imitating my dad. I wanted to look just like my dad. And even here, where I'm the only guy that wears a bolo tie, as expensive as they are. I know, I'm the only guy that wears a bolo tie. Why do I wear a bolo tie? Why, you know, and I thought it was kind of insulting to you if I would wear a Western tie. I've got like 200 ties.
Why would it be offensive? Why would you think that?
Well, I'm trying to show you that I want to be respectful of your culture by wearing a bolo tie. And of course I have different ones. I have one that Wilson made. I wore that the other day. Okay, I'll wear it again. And I have some from up north. Does that offend you? I have a crow tie, I have an Assiniboine tie. I'll tell you what they are when I wear them. Humans are said to have a prestige bias. So, you know, my dad was a great man as far as I was concerned, so I wanted to look just like my dad. If you look at college professors in older movies, if you look at my college professors, of course I went to school in the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. I went to college in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's Bernie. My college professors all wore work shirts because it was a time of rebellion in the United States. So they refused to wear ties, they refused to wear coats. They wore work shirts so that they could show that they were one with the common man, with the working class people. That's what they wanted to look like. So they wore work shirts. Now, weirdly enough, this is really kind of strange, but they started wearing these work shirts, and all of a sudden, the work shirts were like 30 and 40 bucks to buy a work shirt. And now they're made in France. You know, you're buying a shirt that's supposed to look like you're a common man, and your shirt costs more than your shoes cost, as weird as that is. Dr. Lerma. Dr. Lerma wears work shirts because he's part of that movement. That he's too young for that, but he still wears shirts just like his college professors did. There was rebellious college professors wearing work shirts to show that they were one with the common man.
Those plaid shirts, long sleeves?
Yeah.
In college?
Yeah, his undergraduate degree's from UCLA. Okay. So his way of dressing is like college professors in California. Okay. I know, it's weird. It's kind of strange. So we all have people that we imitate. I imitate my dad. Some college professors wear work shirts and imitate the college professors that they had when they were in college. They are especially concerned with detecting who has prestige. And of course, as far as I was concerned, my dad was a banker, he was my dad, and he had prestige, so I wanted to look like him. They seek others who have skills that they respect by others, that are respected by others, and they try to imitate what these individuals are doing. So if you had a hunter, a famous hunter, you would want to look like that hunter. You know, you're living in a buffalo hunting society, so you would want, and he always is able to bring down the buffalo. So you would want to look like him. You'd want to dress like him. You would wear wrist guards for the bow and arrow.
Bogart.
Bogart, thank you, Bogart. Yes, ma'am.
My aunties, they went down to California, Sherman Institute, when they were like teenagers. They went to school down that
Boarding school.
Yeah, and they stayed there for several years, and when they came back, they were like acting different, like fighting. Like when they began to eat, they used to hold their bread like this when they came back. Yeah,
That's what
everything's like,
you're supposed to hold it that way.
no, they just like eating like this.
You don't eat like that?
Anything they touch, they used to go like this.
With 2 fingers? Like
Yeah,
it was
no,
dirty?
something like that.
Imitating. They're imitating the
Yeah.
people that they found prestigious. And this is known as prestige bias. I've told you before that my mother swore like a sailor. My mother was terrible. Or wonderful, I guess. Any way you want to look at it. For a long time, I didn't swear. And then my mother got sick and she got really old. And I started swearing just like my mother did. So one of the reasons I do swear is because I'm imitating my mother. And I really respected my mother because she would look at somebody and her favorite phrase was, a son of a bitch is a son of a bitch. Which means that if somebody's a jackass, they're always going to be a jackass and there's nothing you can do about it. So just because somebody's president of the United States, if he's a jackass, if he's a son of a bitch, he's a son of a bitch. There's just no two ways about it. It's my mother. She always, and she was usually talking about a doctor because she was a nurse. And there are good doctors and bad doctors, and some doctors are just sons of bitches. And she would say, a son of a bitch is a son of a bitch. And you can quote my mother if you like, because a son of a bitch is really a son of a bitch. So I've tried not to be a son of a bitch all my life, not thinking that I'm insulting my mother if I was, okay. Imitating prestigious others is a very efficient way of cultural learning. So we want to act just like the people that we admire. We want to act like the holy men. We want to act like the medicine men. We want to act like the people around us, our aunts, our uncles, or whatever. I have an aunt that didn't believe in sex, as weird as that sounds. And she never had any kids, and she always acted prim and proper. And there were nieces that imitated her. They wanted to be just like her. She was a school teacher, and they wanted to be just like her. And so they became school teachers, and they became virgin school teachers, as weird as that sounds, because that was my aunt, and they wanted to be just like her. And that was their prestige bias. My aunt, and she was brilliant. She was a French teacher and a typing teacher, as weird as that sounds. But she traveled all over the world, took pictures, and she has these wonderful pictures of Rome and Vienna and Paris. Now I want to be my aunt. No, I think that ship sailed a long time ago. I can't be my aunt. Individuals are more likely to learn successfully if they target those people who are especially talented, and of course that's what happened with my aunt. So there are select nieces, she had select nieces and great nieces who act just like she did. I have a niece in Chicago, and of course my aunt lived in Chicago, and she taught at Proviso East. Not that that's important, you've never heard of Proviso East, but she taught at this really big high school. And everybody loved her, and she was Aunt Alice, that's who she was. And so she had a niece that acted just like her. And now my niece, her great niece, acts just like she does. Wanders around the world. She just went to Poland. Where else did she go? Copenhagen. She was in Copenhagen over the Christmas holiday. She travels, she takes all of her money and she spends it on traveling, just like my aunt did. Identifying signs of prestige and imitating people who displayed those signs or skills that were likely selected for in the course of human evolution. So we are looking to imitate people who allow us to live a more prestigious life. Sometimes there are singers who we admire especially, and so we start dressing and acting and talking like them. This happened with Pat Benatar, as weird as that sounds. You guys have never heard of Pat, but women started dressing just like Pat Benatar. Then there was Madonna. Madonna started putting her underwear on the outside of her clothes, and so girls started going to school with their underwear on their outside of their clothes. Or maybe it was another set of underwear. I don't know how this works. I didn't try to figure out where their underwear was. I could see it on the outside. So they started wearing their underwear on the outside. I don't know if there's anybody today that people are trying to look like. No.
Wait, people who are trying to look like somebody?
Justin Bieber. No, he's got all those tattoos. He's not singing anymore, is he?
He came out with a new song. Kind of stupid. I don't like Justin Bieber, so I think all of his music's stupid.
I don't know. I don't know if there's anybody that we're trying to look like now or not. Somebody makes a movie and they got their hair done a certain way, all of a sudden everybody's got their hair cut that way or a certain way. I don't know. I don't know if there's anybody today. I'm trying to think of somebody, and well, we are so deluded now. Once upon a time, we watched television, and that was all there was. So people wanted to look like people on television or dress like people on television.
So, YouTubers, they come out with their merchandise and they have stuff on there and they say you can wear this and you can look like me and have
Right.
my logo. Is that the same thing?
Yeah, that'd be the same thing.
There's a lot.
Imitating them, buying those clothes so that you look like.
Like the makeup industry.
Yeah.
What was that guy's name? The one that has that makeup guy?
Jeffree Star.
Yeah, Jeffree
Yeah.
Star. Jeffree Star has his makeup and like.
Wait a minute, didn't he just break up with his boyfriend?
How do you know that?
It was on CNN.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
I know, and I clicked on it, and there was Jeffree Star crying because his boyfriend was gone.
Yeah.
Or, I don't remember
Or not
who left
died.
who.
Broke up, sorry. He broke up.
Dummy?
I don't think they were married.
No.
Okay.
No.
I don't
So like that, right?
Yeah.
know. Or,
I mean, like 10 years ago, like if looking back, I could see how they're imitating, like how certain hairstyles, the dress, and how they used to imitate what the style was then.
Right.
Now it's kind of hard, like, because we're in it now, I
Right.
guess, and we don't really think of it, we don't really process it right away until, I guess maybe a week later, then it's like,
Wait
oh.
until your daughter gets old enough to start watching YouTube.
Well, she's watching like Frozen, and everything is Frozen. Like everything has to be like Elsa and Anna.
Mhm.
Like her shoes has to be Elsa and
And
Anna.
they're dancing
Her,
like them too.
and she sings like even when we're driving, she says Elsa Anna song, so we have to like sing it. So
What torture.
yeah, and like we watch it a million times, and it's like okay.
When she gets to be 12 or 13 years old, all of a sudden it will be whoever's popular at the time.
My sister is 12, and I can see it.
Yeah.
She like, there's certain things she wants, certain things, like if you buy something, she will not wear it unless she picks it out herself.
yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
because she knows what is supposed to be worn today, or right now,
Mhm.
and you have no clue. You just want the cutest.
I feel old now.
Yeah, you're really old. You just want the cutest thing that is the least expensive thing,
Mhm.
and she wants whatever she's supposed to wear.
Mhm.
Air Jordans, for a long time, boys had to wear Air Jordans, even though they were like $150.
I wore Jordans.
You're an Air
When
Jordan.
my dad and his family were big Jordan fans, so when we were little, he used to buy us shoes. But until I got to like around 12, and I said, no more Jordans, like they're too expensive, and I'm just gonna outgrow them soon. So I stopped buying Jordans. Just because it was Michael Jordan,
Of
so.
course, just because it was Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player that ever lived in the 1990s.
Was that my time? No,
No, it was before. It was before
So-
your time.
I don't get it then.
It was your dad's time.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's why he made us wear it too.
Right. Number 23, Michael Jordan. Our ancestors who did this were more likely to acquire the highly useful cultural knowledge that gave them a survival advantage compared with those who did not. And of course, this is why you study your traditions. You're studying your traditions because this has allowed you to be distinctive. And other tribes don't do that. They don't teach the same thing. I used to teach up north, and I was an advisor. We had a guy that came down. He was actually from Fort Belknap. He was actually from that reservation, but he had gone to school up in Alaska, and he had to study things like whales, whales and totem poles. I mean, all kinds of interesting things, and that fit up there. But of course, when he came down to the buffalo country. That didn't make any sense at all. Why in the world would you study, what does that have to do with anything other than the traditions and culture of the Yupik, the Inuit, and the Aleut, whales? Yeah, okay. And seals, as weird as that is. But I gave him credit for it, because as far as I was concerned, that was a tradition that he had learned. Even though it wasn't his tradition, it was still a tradition. If somebody from up north came down here to go to school, they'd have to learn Navajo, even though Athabascan isn't anywhere close to their language that they speak. And they would have to learn your traditions, and they'd have to pass Wilson's class. Yeah. Or a Hopi. What if a Hopi came over here? They don't have their own college, do they? I don't think they do. They'd have to learn your traditions. Even though they would know that it's not right, because they've got their own traditions. They've got their own religion, as weird as that seems. And I hope that's the way you guys dealt with Christianity. Christianity tried to teach you that there's only one way. Remember the one way, the finger. What? I was watching a movie the other day. This is a movie before, in the 1930s, they realized that some of these movies were pretty risque. So they decided that they would control them. They would censor them. They wouldn't allow anything go out in the culture unless it was censored by the people who didn't want to see nudity and didn't want to see obscene gestures. Well, this was a movie made in 1933, and it was about World War I pilots. This one guy was flying along, and this other guy was trying to tell him, you know, he's rigged your plane and you're going to crash. He's trying to tell him that, and the guy just started laughing, and he gave him the finger. Now, I thought that was a little weird. Even in today's movies, you really don't see the finger that much. But here, this is a movie from the 1930s, and this guy's giving this other guy the finger. And I was thinking, you know, in the 1930s, how many people knew what that meant? Or maybe it meant something different back in the 1930s. Here's a symbol that we use today, which is about the most obscene thing that you can do. And here it's in a movie from the 1930s. I know, it was weird. And it always has to do with airplanes. Every time there's airplanes involved, somebody's giving somebody else the finger. And this is in the early 1930s. It was just kind of curious as far as I was concerned. So watch old movies if you want to see obscene gestures. I've seen naked people in silent films. I mean, they were completely naked, and I was going, wait a minute. This is pre-code. It was before they started censoring.
I gotta add to that. Earlier at lunchtime, I was sitting with a couple of my dads, clan dads, my actual dad and one of my clan dads.
Sure.
We're talking about ceremonialism and everything
Sure.
like that. And he told me a joke, and I said, he's talking about imitating this guy, this old man, he has his glasses down here and everything like that. He goes, I don't know why his glasses were even down here, while he was looking at people up here. And he was talking about that.
I know.
And I told him, I said, did you ever hear about that story about, or that joke about that old man, that he was taking care of ceremony, his glasses were down here, and he was looking at people like this. As he was talking, his hand was like this, the middle finger was going this, and he was saying, this way is good. And all the people were looking at him like confused, like thinking, what's he talking about? He's saying that while he's doing this.
You probably didn't know what it meant.
Yeah.
Or ceremonially, maybe that's the way you're supposed to do it. Just a thought. I mean, he could have it that way. Humans have what is known as theory of mind. Theory of mind means that people understand that others have minds that are different from their own, and thus that other people have perspectives and intentions that are different from their own. So I understand that Denise doesn't think like I do. Like she's different than I am. She's a lot younger than I am, for one thing. She's female, so she has a different mindset than I do. She's Navajo and I'm white, so we probably don't think the same. I understand that you're not going to think the same thoughts that I do. And I worry about that sometimes, because as I'm talking to you, I'm worrying about, you know, the whole ceremonial thing. And me doing something that you guys will go, that's not right, you shouldn't have done that. But you don't, of course, I'm trying to read your minds in essence. And so that's what we all do, we try to read people's minds. When I'm at Walmart I went to Walmart on Saturday, biggest mistake I've ever made. My God, there were no carts, there were literally no carts when I went out there.
Gallup?
It was in Gallup, yeah. I had to go out in the parking lot and find a cart that somebody had just dumped in order to go to the, it was horrible. It was the worst experience of my life. I think I probably killed 4 or 5 people in the store by running over them, you know, and you had to wait before you could go out into the aisle because, you know, there were people zipping back and forth. And
Everywhere.
It was horrible, yes ma'am.
That's on the first of the month. First, second, third is when they get their checks.
Yeah. You know, somebody else told me that, but it wasn't, but it was still a Saturday. And everybody was there with not just their kids, but with, you know, their aunties and their...
Nope.
There were people in wheelchairs, I mean, it was just a mess. You couldn't go anywhere. It probably took me twice as long to buy my groceries as it would have if I usually go on Friday when the kids are in school, okay? So it's just mom and dad that's there.
Or go in there at 2 a.m. I went into Walmart because they're open really late, or they're open 24/7. There was nobody, and I was like, "This is
And you get like
great."
the first pick out of
You
everything.
gotta be real young to do that.
Oh, yeah.
It was after.
I did that when I was
No
like
way,
twenty.
I'm gonna be in Walmart after 9 p.m.
Jeez. Yeah, my bedtime's 9 o'clock,
Oh,
so
okay.
yeah, I have a problem.
I go to Target now in Farmington.
Is it more expensive than Walmart?
It's just a couple cents, but there's not a lot of people in there.
I'm cheap. I really am. I got all the money in the world, but I still go to Walmart to buy my food.
Well, if I go to Walmart, either way, I still buy unnecessary things.
Yeah.
And I know where everything is in Walmart, and I know what they have. They don't have any...
Have you tried doing the online buying?
No.
They shop for you, they actually,
I don't trust anybody else to do that.
they just go and then they put it in the cart.
That's a good point.
And then they,
Well, I buy a lot of produce, so I want to pick my own apples. I want to pick my own lemons, my own onions, my own potatoes. Imitative learning is where the learner copies precisely what they think the model is trying to do. Emulative learning is where the learner is focused on the environmental events that are involved. The emulative learner is only focused on the events that happened around the model, not what the model intends to accomplish. In other words, they're not trying to read his mind, they're just trying to do what that individual did. They're not trying to figure out why it happened that way. In emulative learning, you learn one task but can't use that knowledge in any other context because it doesn't fit anyplace else. It would be like using a screwdriver to take your carburetor off. Now you know how to take a carburetor off, but you can't take the fan belt off. You can't take the water pump off. You can't do anything else because the screwdriver is just for the carburetor. That's how your brain works. Human cultural learning is cumulative, so everything that we learn is all added up. All of your cultural knowledge. Everything you learn from Wilson, everything you learn from your parents and your grandparents, you put all of that together, and then you can figure out what your culture is supposed to look like. Cultural information grows in complexity and often in utility over time. A good example is cars. When I was a kid, cars were they all had big, heavy engines. They were all made out of cast iron. The engines were made out of cast iron. If you started a car, you had to let it run until it warmed up. Now they're all made out of aluminum. You don't have to wait. You don't have to warm up your car in order to drive it because the aluminum heats up really fast. Cast iron heats up relatively slow. But I had a neighbor who's no longer there, Ken Losey's no longer there. He had an old 4Runner, a Toyota 4Runner, and he would sit and he would warm that car up for 5 minutes before he went anywhere. And so he would get in his car and he would sit there for 5 minutes and warm up his car. And I would jump in my car and I would take off. Because you don't have to warm up cars anymore. They're made out of aluminum. This is something that's cumulative. Back in the old days, for the longest time, you had to buy extra side mirrors. The only mirror you had was the one inside your car. That was the only rear view mirror you had. There were no mirrors over here. So as time went by, you learned how to read what was behind you from the mirror inside your car. And then all of a sudden, if you were rich enough, they put side mirrors on your car. So now all of a sudden, you could check your one mirror, you could check the other mirror, you could check the mirror that's inside the car. Okay, so what do we have now? Now we have cameras in the back of our car that tells us how to back up. Isn't that weird? If you could buy a car that parallel parks by itself. I've seen it on television.
Yeah,
I've never
yeah,
driven it. Yeah, it's weird. This is really weird stuff. So my wife is really bad at backing up. I mean, for some reason, I don't know, she just doesn't do it very well, okay? So she loves the camera, but so that she can see what's going on behind her. She uses the camera. I can't use the camera. I have to use the side mirrors in order to back up. If I try to use the camera, I'm all over the place. I'm never where I'm supposed to go. As weird as that is. And this all has to do with cumulative knowledge. I learned to back up. I learned to parallel park. I can parallel park really well. I don't need Ford to tell me how to parallel park, or Mercedes, or Subaru, or whoever. I can do it myself. But my wife can't. She can't back up. She always hits something. Dents all over the back of her car. This is called ratchet effect. Like the ratchet, it always moves forward and is not allowed to slip backward. We're not going to go back to horses. We will always have some kind of a horseless carriage. We're not going to start using goats or you guys aren't going to start using dogs to haul your produce to market. It's just not going to happen. You've got trucks. Eventually, of course, we will change what type of energy that you use. Right now we have internal combustion engines. Maybe in the future everything will be electric. Ford just came out with the E-Mach, the Mustang E-Mach. It's an electric car. Lots of electric cars out there. Tesla's making one. Toyota's got one. Of course, Prius has been out there for a long time. So potentially, of course, eventually we won't have internal combustion engines anymore. Cultural information can continue to accumulate without losing the earlier information, and that's normally the way it works in the culture. And this is one of the questions I have, and I probably shouldn't harass people so much about this. I shouldn't. But it seems to me like your culture may have changed because of your interaction with Western people, with Christianity especially. Because a lot of your traditions seem to fit the Christian ideas. And I'm just wondering if your traditions weren't changed so that they fit more closely with the Christian ideas. One of them has to do with sexuality, with the way you dress. You're not supposed to see anybody naked. Now wait a minute, is that your idea, or is that some crazy priest from Spain that decided that he was going to change your culture? Is that the way it has been? So one of the things I talk about, and of course I shouldn't even talk to Wilson about pre-Columbian traditions. Well, one of the things I talk to him about from time to time is this the real tradition that comes from, you crawling up into this world Is that where it came from? Or is this something that you have incorporated from Christianity so that you can get along with the Christians? They don't want to see you with your wandering around with your tops off, so you decided that nobody can walk around with bare-chested. Not even men. That drives me nuts. Because where I come from, men hardly ever wear shirts, especially in the summertime. But you guys don't wear. You guys all wear shirts, and it's insulting or embarrassing or acultural for a man to want to not have a shirt on. Now I know that's not the same way with other natives, because up north, first time I went into the weight room, nobody had a shirt on but me. I was the only one with a shirt on.
You know, if you're gonna ask questions like that, it's best off to ask somebody who knows about the net philosophy, and also more about, well, probably the same amount or more about westernized civilization. And that way you'll see
Right.
the difference between both of them. Because
I figured Wilson had all the answers.
like if you were to go to like a person that's pretty much just informative with the net philosophy, they're gonna stand their ground and say yes and no.
Yeah.
And what you're asking, I've actually questioned the same thing too. Because there's a course that teaches about Navajo history before the European contact or the Spanish contact.
Right.
Before that, we've adopted many types of lifestyles, such as what we call tradition nowadays, like the hair
Exactly.
bun, some of the dresses, jewelry,
Right.
and ceremonial beings, ceremonial ways of life
Right.
as well too, in the clans. And with that, before that, makes me wonder, you know, what were Navajos in the first place?
Exactly.
Before all of that, you know?
Right.
And, you know, it's like, why don't these holistic traditionalists or elders talk about documentation stating that this is how it was a long
Right.
time ago?
Of course, nothing was written down, so
Yeah.
that's a problem.
Or anything that indicates that,
Right.
like, this was going on, you know? It's just like how the Anasazis left drawings here and dwellings here,
Right.
canyons in the walls and stuff like that, you know? I'm just wondering why Navajos didn't do that.
Well, for the longest time, you guys didn't claim Anasazi ancestry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now all of a sudden, you do, which is really confusing to me, because I get confused really easily. But it seems to me that, I don't know, we still don't know who the Anasazi were, or whether they all disappeared or became Zuni and Hopi and whatever.
So-
Or maybe they did become Athabascan.
So you're asking if Native American culture incorporated Christianity just to
Get
be
along.
okay?
Yeah.
I think they did. Not necessarily maybe Navajo tradition, but Native American church especially.
Well, Native American church is not that old. Well, depending on whose argument you're listening to.
Yeah.
The modern Native American church isn't that old.
Yeah.
Maybe there's an older version of it, but
Apparently.
it disappeared and then came back. The Cheyenne, I know you guys hate to talk about other tribes. The Cheyenne, they used to sacrifice a maiden in the spring so that they could, the buffalo would come back. After the winter was over with, they would sacrifice a maiden. And that's where the morning star comes from, the 8-pointed star. That's where that comes from. Well, they stopped doing that, of course. I mean, Christians or soldiers aren't going to let you just sacrifice somebody. It's not going to happen. And of course, the Christian church came in, the Catholic church came in, and stopped them from doing it. So that's a good example of traditions changing by Christian standards.
One thing that she reminded me again, when I was thinking earlier, when you asked about that, when you got to the sex part, was another thing too, was our ancestors, the chiefs would have many wives. But then once these treaties came about and European contact
Right.
came about, seemed like that all changed, you know?
Sure, well, of course. I mean, they were trying to control, they were having problems with different religious groups. One religious group allowed as many wives as you could accumulate, the Mormons. And so they, by trying to control them, they wrote a law that said you couldn't have more than one wife. And that theoretically was supposed to stop the Mormons from having plural marriages. So they couldn't let anybody else do it either. Quanah Parker, you know, the great Comanche chief who was one of the founders of the modern Native American church, had 4 wives. And when they told him he could only have one, he said, "You pick. I'm not gonna pick." Because, you know, but he had 4 wives and he lived with all 4 of them. And he actually lived with all 4 of them the rest of his life. This is a question that I can ask, but you guys probably,
I think it's a matter of survival.
What,
Like
wives?
our-
The number of
no,
wives?
No, like our culture, Navajo culture, the way our tradition is, we tend to adopt just to survive. So
Right,
that's just the way I view it.
right. So something that is a tradition may actually be an
Adopted.
adoption.
But then again, some people mistake lifestyle as culture. And then
Right.
some people, you know, carry culture through ceremonial ways.
Right,
So I believe that for us, ceremonial teachings and what we say bahanet means, the story of it,
Right.
the origin of what you're talking about,
Right.
about the first worlds and everything like that, is true, could be true, pretty much is true, because we came from somewhere, you know. And at the same time, within the westernized civilization, they have theories as well, too.
Sure.
And that only goes to a certain extent of
Right.
history, and which we could relate as well, too. So
Right.
basically, you could say, you know, it's coming from somewhere. But then, nowadays, our lifestyle is different, and I believe that that is what was changed.
and once again, you're going to have to adopt in order to adapt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see if your traditions change. Now, one of the things that you need to remember about Western culture is that Western culture has science behind it. Now, one of the problems with science is that it's seen through Western eyes. So they're only seeing things that support their ideas. That's the way it works. I know scientific method is supposed to be blind, and they're supposed to only accept what they see, but the reality is they're actually looking for proof that what they're saying is true.
Another thing too about that is, like I was saying, ceremonial ways, when it comes to traditionalism. I know that westernized culture doesn't believe in our ceremonies. And
Right.
it could be like, I can understand that, see that, say, oh, they're just talking about stories about coming from different worlds and this and that. But in actuality, we still believe it to this day, but through ceremonial wise, and through the ceremonies when they take place, they heal us
Right.
through the, whatever it is that's ailing us and everything
Right.
like that. And it makes you wonder, if these ceremonies are real, and they're actually helping.
If they heal you, then they're
Yeah,
real.
Yeah, they're real.
Right.
But yet, in order for it to heal us, we believe in that system and that.
Exactly.
that-
You have to
that
believe it
story.
in order for
Yeah.
it to work. So if I had a ceremony for me, it probably wouldn't work. For one thing, I'm not Navajo, and for another thing, my belief system is mostly PowerPoint. It's based on PowerPoint.
But then if it don't work, then basically, it's easy to say that,
It doesn't work for me, but it works for you, and it works.
No, you could say that, you know, if it doesn't work, then yes, there's nothing there. They're just
Right.
wishing, basically wishing, just
Sure.
praying for nothing, you know.
Placebo effect. Sure. A lot of things happen because of the placebo effect, and that's okay. As long as you get better, everything's better. To have cumulative cultural evolution, you need creative invention. Somebody needs to invent something, like the car, or the backup camera that some people use. Do you have a backup camera in your car?
Don't
My
need it.
wife loves it. Reliable and faithful social transmission. In other words, we have to pass it from one person to the next. High fidelity social transmission requires accurate imitative learning and sophisticated communication. Once upon a time, this is kind of a strange story, and I've just barely got enough time to tell it. Once upon a time, China wouldn't allow they wouldn't allow Bibles in their country. They wouldn't allow anybody to talk about Christianity because it was an imperial system, and they wouldn't allow it to happen. But the Christians, being the jackasses that they are, oh, that's on tape, isn't it? Decided that they would smuggle pamphlets into China. And so they took passages of the Bible and they smuggled them into China. Not the whole Bible, they couldn't do that, but they smuggled pamphlets into China. So this guy in rural China got a hold of a pamphlet and he started reading it and he thought it was real, it was true. So he started preaching that pamphlet. He didn't have any of the rest of the Bible, he just had this, 15 pages of Bible. And he was able to convince a lot of people that this was the way it was, that Jesus was the Son of God, and that he was the Chinese Son of God. So he started a revolution in China. This was in the 1850s, 1860s.
Wow.
And he had millions of people that followed him. Now, according to this passage of the Bible, you weren't supposed to have sex because sex was dirty. China has a lot of people. Where did all those people come from? Well, they didn't come from not having sex. So what happened was he started accumulating all these people. All these males and females that didn't want to have sex became his soldiers. And they started conquering places. And if they wouldn't convert, they'd kill them. Millions of people died because this guy read a pamphlet, and it was called the Taiping Revolution. Millions of people died. He took over a third of the landmass of China. But of course, they couldn't sustain themselves because people weren't allowed to have sex, except for the Chinese Son of God. He was allowed to have sex, but he was the only one. And eventually, of course, people got frustrated. They left the group, and eventually they were defeated. But millions of people died, and just from an idea. Why am I talking about this? Transmission of information. So he got a little piece of information, and it just took off like a rocket ship. And of course, he almost conquered all of China. And people will still talk about it today. Christians still talk, missionaries still talk about it today because it was very successful. Just that one little pamphlet. Jesus is so strong that 15 pages of the Bible were able to kill millions of people. Wow, there you go. And actually, that's what we're talking about here. No species but humans have shown these capacities. We're the only ones that can do this kind of stuff. Anyway, that was a Taiping uprising in China.
I saw this video of this guy